They called him a failed rancher, a man with nothing left but debts and regrets. But when Jack Turner inherited a rotting orchard and an old Appaloosa horse named Sundance, he never imagined the horse would guide him into a 40-year secret worth billions, one that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. Stay with me, because what begins with decay and despair will end with truth, rebirth, and the wisdom of a horse. Jack Turner sat alone in the small trailer he now called home, the November wind rattling the thin aluminum walls like an old drum. The ranch in Montana that had once been his pride was gone, sold off piece by piece after medical bills had eaten everything he'd built. His wife's accident had left scars deeper than bone, and though she was alive, the cost of saving her had left him hollow. Now he lived on coffee too bitter to taste, and silence too thick to swallow. The knock at the door startled him. Mail hadn't come here in weeks, not since the last of the bills stopped following him. He opened the door to find a delivery driver holding out a thick envelope, its paper yellowed with age, the name Jacob Turner scrawled across it in careful ink. Nobody called him Jacob anymore. Nobody except one man, his late uncle, Henry Whitfield. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Inside was a letter written in a shaky hand and a legal document with a red seal. Uncle Henry was gone. The words sat cold on the page, final and unbending. Along with his passing, Henry had left Jack something, a property in Snake River Valley, Idaho. 100 acres of neglected apple orchard and, oddly enough, one aging Appaloosa horse named Sundance. Jack let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. An orchard? He knew cattle, not apples. And a horse? He had sold the last of his stock months ago, each sale a small betrayal that left him emptier than the one before. This inheritance felt less like a gift and more like another cruel joke from life. A reminder of how far he'd fallen. Still, as the night deepened, Jack couldn't shake the weight of the letter. The handwriting, fragile yet deliberate, carried a whisper of Henry's voice. He remembered faintly the old man's stern face, the way he never fit in with the family, living apart in the valley with nothing but trees and that spotted horse for company. They had said Henry was strange. Some said he was half mad. Jack had only met him a handful of times, and each meeting had been marked by silence heavier than words. The trailer walls groaned again under the wind, and Jack stared at the letter until the words blurred. He had nothing left to lose. No ranch, no pride, no real plan for tomorrow. A forgotten orchard in Idaho was at least a direction, and maybe, though he wouldn't admit it out loud, he was too tired to keep running from the ghosts of his failures. The next morning, he loaded the little he owned into his old Ford pickup. The road stretched long and gray before him, carved through hills dusted with early snow. He drove with the heater broken, his breath fogging the windshield. The mountains loomed like silent witnesses as miles gave way to the rugged valley Henry had called home. When Jack finally pulled up the dirt road to the orchard, dusk was falling. The sky was painted in bruised purples, the kind of twilight that carried a chill straight into the bones. What lay before him looked less like an orchard and more like a graveyard. Apple trees stood crooked and broken, their bark scarred black, branches clawing at the sky as if begging for mercy. The ground was littered with rotten fruit, a sour, sweet stench rising from the earth. At the edge of the pasture stood a sagging wooden fence, and behind it, motionless as stone, was the horse. Sundance. His coat, once white dappled with dark spots, had dulled to gray, and his mane hung tangled and unkempt. Yet his eyes, those eyes caught Jack's breath. They were steady, deep, watching him with a patience that felt unnerving. Jack leaned against his truck, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. "So this is it," he muttered. The orchard reeked of decay, the house sagged with neglect, and the horse looked like a relic too stubborn to die. Everything screamed of endings. Yet Sundance flicked an ear, stamped one hoof, and for the briefest moment, Jack thought he saw recognition, like the horse had been waiting for him, and him alone. He shook the thought off. He'd stopped believing in omens long ago. Jack exhaled, the steam of his breath curling into the twilight. Behind him, the orchard groaned under the weight of silence. Before him, the horse shifted, watching, as if daring him to take one step closer. And Jack, tired of running from everything, lifted his boots and crossed the fence. The fence groaned as Jack swung himself over, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The ground felt spongy, the rot of fallen apples seeping up through the soles of his shoes. He tried not to look down, but the smell of fermentation was everywhere, clinging to the cold evening air like a sour perfume. Sundance stood only a few yards away, head lowered, chewing slowly as if nothing in the world had changed. Jack hesitated, then stepped closer. The horse flicked an ear in his direction, but did not move. His coat was muddied, the dapples blurred into gray shadows, but his eyes remained fixed on Jack, with an unnerving calm. Jack reached out a tentative hand, then pulled it back before touching. He wasn't ready. Not for the horse, not for this place. He turned instead toward the house at the far end of the orchard. The path leading there was broken, stones jutting out between weeds, the kind of neglect that spoke of years of silence. The house itself sagged under the weight of weather and time. Shutters hung by rusted hinges, the porch boards bent beneath his boots. He ran a hand along the rail, and flakes of faded green paint crumbled into his palm. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and mildew. A few pieces of furniture remained. A rocking chair with its seat sagging, a table scored by decades of knife marks, shelves lined with jars that had long since clouded with mold. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but crowded, with the weight of things left unsaid. Jack dropped his duffel bag by the door and sank into the chair, the wood creaking beneath him. For a long time, he listened to the orchard groan in the wind. Branches scraped against each other, a sound like whispers. He thought of Henry living here alone, year after year, walking among these trees and speaking to no one but a horse. The thought unsettled him, and for a brief moment he wondered if this inheritance was less a gift and more a burden. A torch passed from one lonely man to another. When he finally stood, the dusk had deepened into night. Through the cracked window, the orchard stretched in shadows, the crooked trees like figures bent in prayer. Sundance had moved closer to the porch, his breath fogging in the cold. Jack opened the door, and the horse lifted his head as if waiting for something. Jack shook his head. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered. "I'm no savior." He lit a single lamp and found the bedroom Henry must have used. The bed sagged in the middle, the blanket thin and moth-eaten. On the nightstand sat an old tin box, empty except for a broken watch and a faded photograph of the orchard in bloom. Trees bursting with white blossoms, sunlight spilling through like grace. Jack held the photo under the lamplight, trying to reconcile the image with the ruin outside. Somewhere between then and now, something had broken beyond repair. The wind rattled the windows again. From outside came the sound of Sundance pawing at the earth, steady, rhythmic. Jack tried to ignore it, but the sound carried through the night, as if the horse were tapping out a message he couldn't yet understand. He lay back on the sagging bed, the photograph still in his hand, the orchard whispering through the walls like a restless ghost. Sleep came in fits, filled with broken dreams. His wife's face pale under hospital lights, the weight of debt notices in his hands, and the orchard twisting around him, branches clutching at his arms. When he woke, dawn had already painted the valley in a pale, merciless gray. His breath hung in the cold air, and he wondered if this place would ever feel like anything but a reminder of loss. Stepping outside, he was struck again by the orchard's decay. The ground was carpeted with bruised apples, their skins split and oozing. The trees leaned as though exhausted, bark blackened in patches that spread like wounds. The smell was stronger in the morning, sweet and rotten, mingled with the sharp tang of frost. It was not just neglect. Something was wrong here, something deeper than years of abandonment. Sundance stood by the fence, watching him. The horse's nostrils flared, and for a moment Jack thought he caught a glimpse of defiance in those dark eyes. He exhaled sharply, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "What do you want from me?" he asked under his breath. The words drifted away, unanswered. At the far edge of the orchard, crows rose in a black flurry, their cries slicing through the stillness. Jack followed their movement until the valley swallowed them. The orchard stretched farther than he'd realized, rolling down into a hollow where fog clung stubbornly to the earth. For the first time, he felt the weight of how much land he'd inherited, and how much he didn't understand. Returning to the porch, he noticed something he hadn't the night before. By the step where Sundance had stood, the ground was churned as if the horse had pawed at it for hours. The earth was disturbed, not just from restless hooves, but from something deliberate. Jack crouched, running his fingers through the loose soil. It crumbled easily, softer than the hardened ground around it. A chill ran through him, though the morning was still. He stood slowly, his eyes meeting Sundance's across the fence. The horse blinked, calm and patient, as though he'd been waiting for Jack to notice. The orchard was rotten. But something beneath its surface was stirring, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Jack felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with debt or loss. It had to do with secrets, and with a horse that seemed to know exactly where to find them. The kettle on the old wood stove hissed weakly, filling the kitchen with the smell of rust and ash. Jack poured himself a cup of black coffee that tasted like the inside of a burned tin, but it was heat in his hands, and that was enough. He stood at the cracked window, looking out at the orchard glazed in morning frost. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by Sundance's slow steps across the paddock. A sharp knock startled him. He set the cup down, wiped his palms against his jeans, and opened the door. On the porch stood a woman bundled in a wool coat, her hair streaked with silver, her face weathered but kind. She held a basket covered with a faded cloth. "Jack Turner?" she asked, her voice low, steady, like someone used to speaking into the wind. "That's me," he said. "I'm Clara," she continued. "I live down the road, 2 miles west. I used to look in on your uncle from time to time. Thought I'd stop by." She held out the basket. "Apple bread?" "Well, apples from the market. Not from here." Jack hesitated, then took it with a nod. "Thank you." Clara stepped past him, glancing around the kitchen as though the place itself was an old acquaintance. Her eyes lingered on the shelves, the table, the kettle hissing on the stove. "Not much has changed," she murmured. Henry was stubborn about keeping things the way they were. Said the house needed memory more than repair. Jack sat across from her at the table, the bread between them. "He didn't talk much," he said, more a statement than a question. Clara smiled faintly. "Not to people. But he talked plenty, to the trees, to that horse of his. Sundance." She tilted her head toward the window, where the spotted gelding stood with ears pricked, watching them. "Said the horse knew more than he did." I used to laugh at that. Now, I'm not so sure Jack followed her gaze. Sundance hadn't moved. The horse's dark eyes seemed locked on the house, on them. Jack shifted uneasily in his chair. "It's just a horse." Clara's smile faded. "That's what you think." But Henry believed different. He used to tell me, "One day Sundance will show the truth to the right person." He never explained what he meant, but he said it with the kind of weight you don't forget. Jack let out a short laugh, trying to dismiss the chill creeping up his spine. "Sounds like something a lonely man would say." "Maybe," Clara said softly. She reached for her coat, rising to her feet. "But lonely men don't always lie. Sometimes they see things the rest of us are too busy to notice." Jack walked her to the porch. The morning light fell sharp across the valley, painting the orchard in brittle shades of gray and silver. Clara paused at the steps, her hand brushing the rail. "You ought to know," she added. "This land isn't just ruined trees. Your uncle cared for it like it carried something bigger than himself. He wanted someone in the family to carry it on. Maybe that's you?" "Maybe not, but you're here now." She gave him a nod, then started down the path, her boots crunching on the frosted ground. Jack watched until she disappeared around the bend, the air suddenly colder in her absence. Behind him, Sundance nickered, low and soft, a sound that vibrated in Jack's chest. He turned. The horse had moved closer to the fence, breath fogging in the chill, ears tilted forward in expectation. Jack clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of Clara's words. He wanted to believe this was nothing, just a dying orchard, a horse too old to matter, the remnants of a life lived in solitude. Yet the thought pressed against him. What if Henry had left him more than land? What if the silence of this valley wasn't emptiness at all, but a secret waiting to be heard? The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rot mixed with earth. Jack pulled his jacket tighter. Sundance pawed at the ground once, deliberate, then stilled. The sound echoed through the morning quiet, a punctuation mark at the end of Clara's warning. Jack closed the door, but even inside, he could feel the horse's gaze on him, steady and unblinking, as though it would follow him wherever he went. That night, the house groaned around Jack as the wind pressed against the walls, rattling the windows in their warped frames. He couldn't sleep. Clara's words replayed in his head, each sentence carrying more weight than he wanted to admit. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint scrape of branches outside, until finally he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and lit the lamp. The light revealed the small bedroom in a new way. Shadows stretched long, clinging to the corners, while the nightstand beside the bed seemed more purposeful than before. Jack's eyes drifted to the drawer he hadn't opened. He pulled it gently, and it stuck halfway, swollen from years of moisture. With a firm tug, it gave way. Inside lay a stack of papers bound with a strip of leather, yellowed, brittle at the edges. Jack set the bundle on the table and unwrapped it carefully. His uncle's handwriting spilled across the pages in neat but uneven lines. The first entry was dated April 1981. Henry had written about the orchard, about the men who came in government trucks, about promises of new methods to strengthen the trees against disease. Jack flipped through, his eyes catching fragments. Compound trials, restricted access, samples secured. The words made little sense, but they carried the rhythm of secrecy. Henry described strangers walking the rows at night, flashlights cutting through the fog. He described crates being loaded into vehicles without plates, and men in dark coats speaking in clipped tones. And always, in the margins, were notes about Sundance, reacted again. Wouldn't leave the tree line. As if he knew. Jack's pulse quickened as he turned the pages. Some entries were crossed out with heavy strokes, as though Henry had regretted writing them. Others ended abruptly mid-sentence. One line caught him cold. "If anyone finds this, trust the horse." He remembers Jack leaned back in the chair, staring at the words until they blurred. He remembered Clara's warning. Henry's silence in life. The way Sundance's eyes seemed fixed on him every moment since he'd arrived. It felt absurd, yet the journal pressed on him with a quiet urgency. He closed the pages and stood, pacing the floor. The lamp flickered as wind found its way through the cracks. Beyond the window, the orchard stretched in a restless sprawl, branches shifting like a sea in the dark. Sundance stood near the fence, unmoving, the faint glow of moonlight outlining his shape. Jack felt the horse's presence even from inside. Restless, he shoved the journal into his jacket pocket and stepped outside. The cold bit hard, stinging his lungs, but the silence was sharper. The orchard smelled of frost and rot, of endings. Yet Sundance's steady gaze broke the stillness. The horse pawed the ground once, the same deliberate gesture Jack had seen that morning. Jack approached slowly. His boots sank into the damp soil, the crunch of frozen leaves underfoot. Sundance didn't back away. Jack reached out, hand brushing the horse's mane, rough and tangled. For the first time, Sundance leaned into the touch. A warmth passed through Jack, startling in its intimacy, as though the animal had been waiting for this exact moment. Jack whispered, "What are you trying to show me?" His breath curled in the air, vanishing into the night. The horse shifted, turning his head toward the far edge of the orchard, ears pricked. Jack followed the line of his gaze. Beyond the twisted rows of trees, the land dipped into shadow, a place he hadn't walked yet. The journal pressed against his chest inside the jacket, the words echoing. Trust the horse. Jack stood there in the brittle night, caught between skepticism and something that felt dangerously close to faith. He wasn't ready to follow Sundance into the dark. Not yet. But he knew he wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. When he returned to the house, the lamp still flickering on the table, he laid the journal flat and stared at the open page. Henry's neat handwriting seemed alive under the trembling light. Each word reached across time, dragging Jack deeper into questions he didn't want, but could no longer turn away from. As he closed the journal, the wind carried a low sound through the orchard. It wasn't branches. It wasn't the cry of a crow. It was Sundance, calling once, steady and sure, as though reminding Jack that this was only the beginning. The morning came with a thin veil of fog, wrapping the orchard in pale gray. Jack stepped onto the porch with the journal still tucked beneath his arm. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Henry's handwriting. Trust the horse. He told himself it was nonsense, yet he found his boots crunching over the frost-hardened earth, moving toward Sundance without thought. The horse greeted him with a snort, ears pricked, breath steaming in the cold. Jack placed a hand against the rough mane, feeling a tremor beneath his fingers. Sundance shifted, then turned deliberately toward the far orchard where the trees grew denser, their branches tangled like ribs of some long-dead creature. Jack muttered, "You really expect me to follow you?" But the horse had already begun walking, steps sure and steady, hooves breaking the crust of frost. Against his better judgment, Jack followed. The air thickened as they moved deeper, the smell of rot more pungent, the ground littered with apples, shriveled to black husks. After a while, Sundance stopped at a massive tree whose trunk rose wider than a doorway. Its bark was silver gray, unscarred, unlike the others around it. Jack ran his hand over the trunk and felt a hollow place near the base. His pulse quickened. He bent and brushed away damp leaves until his fingers struck something hard, smooth wood beneath the soil. Heart pounding, Jack clawed at the dirt, pulling free a small wooden box sealed with wax darkened by age. The hinges were rusted, but intact. He sat back on his heels, staring at it in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. Sundance stood quietly nearby, ears forward, waiting. Jack pried the box open with his pocket knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a bundle of photographs and folded papers. His hands shook as he lifted them into the light. The photographs were grainy, black and white, showing men in suits among the orchard rows, their faces turned away, their movements furtive. One photo showed a truck with its rear doors open, crates being loaded under cover of night. Beneath the photos lay pages of chemical reports, diagrams, and a letter in Henry's hand. Jack unfolded it carefully. "If you are reading this, then Sundance has done his job." These trees were never ordinary. They were changed, altered by men who promised health but stole without conscience. The compounds within these apples became the foundation of medicines worth fortunes, while I was left with silence. I have hidden what I could. Trust the horse. He will lead you. Jack lowered the letter. Breath caught in his throat. The orchard swayed in the wind, branches creaking as though agreeing with Henry's words. He sat there for a long moment, stunned. All the talk of experiments, government men, hidden truths, it wasn't rambling madness. It was real. Sundance pawed the ground once, the sound sharp in the morning quiet. Jack met the horse's gaze. The eyes staring back at him were calm, unwavering, as if to say, "You see now." He gathered the papers, the photos, and closed the box. The weight of it felt heavier than wood and paper. It felt like inheritance in the truest, most terrifying sense. He tucked it under his arm and began the walk back toward the house. Sundance followed, hooves muffled on the damp ground, the rhythm steady behind him. On the porch, Jack set the box down on the table and pored over its contents again, tracing Henry's handwriting with his fingertips. Every line spoke of betrayal and endurance, of a man who had carried a secret so large it had caged him inside this orchard for decades. Jack felt a surge of anger, not at Henry, but at the faceless men who had taken everything from him and left him to rot in silence. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. A bitter laugh escaped his throat. "You were right, old man. And now it's my problem." Outside, Sundance nickered softly, the sound carrying through the valley like an answer. Jack closed his eyes, the box heavy beside him, and wondered what he had just stepped into. Jack couldn't remember how long he sat at the table with the wooden box open before him. Morning bled into afternoon, the shadows in the room shifting, but he hardly moved. The photographs lay scattered across the scarred tabletop, the chemical reports half unfolded, Henry's letter trembling slightly in the draft that whistled through the cracks of the old house. Each page he read seemed to carve a deeper hollow in his chest. He had come here expecting to find ruin, maybe a few mementos of an eccentric old man's life. Instead, he was staring at evidence of something vast and deliberate, something that connected his uncle's solitude to laboratories, corporations, and fortunes beyond imagination. He pushed the papers away and stood, pacing the narrow kitchen. The floorboards creaked under his boots, a sound that echoed the restless churn inside him. He thought of his wife lying in that hospital bed months earlier, doctors whispering about the cost of experimental treatments. He thought of the medical bills that had drowned him. And now, in front of him, he held documents hinting that this very orchard had once birthed the compounds that saved lives, including hers. Jack gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles whitened. If Henry was right, the medicines that had saved thousands, maybe millions, had grown out of these trees, and his uncle had been erased from the story. Outside, Sundance shifted near the fence, letting out a low, steady whicker. Jack turned toward the window. The horse's breath rose in soft clouds, his body still, eyes fixed on the house as if he could sense the storm turning inside Jack. "You knew," Jack whispered, the words muffled against the glass. "Somehow you've always known." He dragged a hand down his face, then returned to the table. There was more in the box, a smaller envelope tucked beneath the chemical reports. He tore it open. Inside was another note in Henry's shaky hand. "They will come back. Not for the orchard, but for the silence. Protect the evidence. Protect yourself." The words struck him cold. He read them again, then shoved the envelope into his jacket pocket. Protect yourself. He hadn't expected that his uncle's ghosts would have teeth in the present. By late afternoon, Jack carried the box upstairs to the attic. Dust fell in clouds as he pushed open the narrow door. The space smelled of old wood and time, the rafters crowded with boxes of tools, jars of rusted nails, and a trunk of clothes gone to moths. He slid the wooden box beneath a loose board in the floor, covering it with care. For now, secrecy was safety. He descended, his body heavy, his thoughts heavier still. Outside, the orchard had shifted in color, the pale gray of morning replaced by the bruised tones of evening. The trees stood like a congregation of withered figures, their branches dark against the sky. Sundance stood in the same place, watching, as though he hadn't moved all day. Jack stepped out onto the porch, sinking onto the steps with his elbows resting on his knees. He lit a cigarette, the ember flaring in the gloom, and exhaled a slow ribbon of smoke. He hated the habit, but tonight the burn steadied him. "You carried this alone for 40 years, he murmured into the valley, as though Henry could still hear. "And now it's mine. Damn you." The wind picked up, rustling the branches. Somewhere deeper in the orchard, a crow called, harsh and ragged. Sundance pawed the ground once, then stilled, his head lifting toward the ridge. Jack followed his gaze but saw only shadows lengthening. Still, a prickle ran up his spine. For the first time, he wondered if Clara had known more than she'd said. Her words, he wanted someone in the family to carry it on, echoed with new meaning now. He imagined her walking these same rows, bringing bread to Henry, maybe glimpsing things she never admitted. The sky darkened into night, and Jack finally rose, bones aching. He stepped to the fence and pressed a hand against Sundance's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, warm and steady. Jack closed his eyes, letting the quiet settle. "I don't know what you expect of me," he said softly, "but I'll try." Sundance exhaled, the sound low and certain, and Jack felt the weight of the past settle fully onto his shoulders. Not as a burden he could ignore, but as an inheritance that would demand everything of him. The following morning broke with a thin sun, a pale light that did little to soften the valley's chill. Jack rose early, restless, his head full of Henry's warnings. He fed Sundance a few flakes of hay from the barn, though the horse seemed less interested in eating and more intent on the orchard beyond. Jack stroked his neck, whispering words he didn't quite believe himself, before heading back inside for coffee. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls until every creak of wood felt amplified. Jack poured the bitter brew into a chipped mug and stood at the window. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would take to bring the orchard back. New soil treatments, pruning, years of care. But the thought evaporated as soon as it came. He wasn't here for hope. He was here because he had nowhere else left. The low growl of an engine cut through the silence. Jack's shoulders stiffened. He stepped to the window just as a dark SUV eased up the dirt road, tires crunching slow and deliberate. The vehicle rolled to a stop at the gate, its glossy surface out of place against the decay of the orchard. Jack set the mug down with a sharp clink. He watched as 3 men stepped out, all dressed in dark coats. They didn't look like neighbors. They didn't look like anyone who belonged in Snake River Valley. The tallest of them adjusted his tie, scanning the property with the detached air of a man assessing a piece of equipment. Another leaned against the hood, lighting a cigarette, the flare of the lighter sharp in the pale morning. The third simply stood with his hands clasped, expression unreadable. Sundance's whinny rang out, sharp and uneasy. Jack turned. The horse had pressed against the fence, ears pinned flat, body tense. He pawed the ground once, then again, the sound a warning that vibrated through the still air. Jack stepped out onto the porch, his boots striking hard against the boards. The tallest man called across the distance, voice smooth, almost polite. "Mr. Turner?" "We'd like a word." Jack didn't answer. He moved to the edge of the porch, arms folded across his chest. "We represent parties interested in this land," the man continued. "It's not worth much in its current state, as I'm sure you've noticed. We'd be willing to take it off your hands, for a fair price, of course." Jack felt his jaw tighten. He thought of Henry's letter, of the photographs, of the phrase, "protect the evidence." These men weren't here to buy dying apple trees. They were here for silence. "Not for sale," Jack said flatly. The man's smile thinned. "Mr. Turner, you might reconsider. A property like this can be burdensome. Taxes, Maintenance. Liability. We're here to offer you relief. Jack stepped down from the porch, closing the distance until he stood just inside the gate. Sundance moved along the fence line with him, shadowing his steps like a silent guardian. I said no, Jack repeated, his voice carrying more steel this time. The man's eyes narrowed, though his smile didn't fade. Think about it. We'll be in touch. He signaled to the others, and they returned to the SUV. The engine roared to life, gravel spitting under the tires as the vehicle backed away down the road. Jack stood there long after the sound faded, his fists clenched. Behind him, Sundance exhaled loudly, a sound almost human in its release. Jack turned, meeting the horse's gaze. You saw it too, he murmured. The horse's ears flicked, his dark eyes unwavering. Jack walked back to the porch, the valley suddenly colder despite the sun climbing higher. The orchard groaned in the breeze, branches shifting like old bones. He felt Henry's warning settle deeper into his chest. They will come back. As he stepped inside, the silence of the house felt different now. Not empty, but watchful. The weight of the box hidden upstairs pressed at him like a stone. He poured another cup of coffee, though his hands trembled, and stood staring out the window, waiting for the next sound of tires on gravel. Outside, Sundance stood tall, ears pricked toward the road, as though he, too, was waiting. The knock came just as the sky was folding into evening. Jack froze in the kitchen, his hand halfway to the drawer where he kept his uncle's old hunting knife. For a heartbeat, he imagined the dark SUV returning, the men stepping out with their unreadable faces and polished shoes. But when he pulled the door open, it was Clara, her wool coat buttoned to her chin, a scarf wound tightly around her neck. She held no basket this time. Her hands were empty, trembling slightly against the cold. You saw them, didn't you? She asked without greeting. Her eyes flicked past him, scanning the orchard before landing on Sundance, who stood watchful by the fence. Jack stepped aside, letting her in. The kitchen felt smaller with her there, the walls closing in around the smell of old coffee and dust. Clara sank into a chair, folding her hands on the table as if to steady herself. They came here once before, she said. Not the same men, but the same kind. Years ago, Henry told, me never to speak of it. But I think you need to know. Jack lowered himself into the chair opposite her. Start from the beginning. She exhaled, her breath shaky. It was the spring of '85. I'd come to bring Henry some supplies. He wasn't much for going into town. There were trucks at the gate, government-looking, no markings. I watched from the ridge. Men walked the orchard rows with clipboards, others loaded crates into the back. Henry stood with them, but he wasn't talking, just watching. His face was, she shook her head, like stone. Jack leaned forward. What were they taking? Clara's eyes flicked to the ceiling, as if the answer might still be written there. Samples, he called them. Fruit, soil, even branches cut straight from the trees. He said they were developing compounds, things that could change medicine. He never told me more. Only that Sundance, she glanced toward the window, seemed to sense everything. That horse wouldn't let the men near him, pinned his ears, lunged at the fence as if he knew they didn't belong. Jack's chest tightened. The image was too vivid. Sundance standing guard even then, decades younger, eyes blazing with the same fire Jack saw now. Henry trusted you, Clara continued softly. More than he trusted anyone else. That's why he left it to you. Not just the land. The burden. Jack rubbed a hand across his face, weary. I didn't ask for this. No one ever does, Clara said. But you're here now. And those men at the gate today? They won't stop. They never stopped watching. The lamp between them buzzed faintly, its glow soft against Clara's lined face. She reached across the table, placing her hand over Jack's. Her skin was cold, her grip firm. Whatever your uncle was keeping, it's still here. And if Sundance is leading you, it means it's time. Don't turn away from it. Jack swallowed hard. The weight of her words settled heavy in his chest. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, Sundance shifted, his shadow stretching long across the frosted ground. He raised his head, ears pointed toward the darkening ridge, as though listening to something far off. Jack finally pulled his hand back and stood. "If you're right," he said quietly, "then this isn't just about me anymore." Clara rose too, wrapping her scarf tighter. At the door, she turned back, her eyes sharp. "No, it's about truth. And truth has a way of finding its voice, no matter how long it's been buried." She left without another word, her figure swallowed by the shadows of the orchard road. Jack remained at the window long after she'd gone. The valley hushed, except for Sundance's steady breathing outside. He thought of Henry's journal, the wooden box, the photographs, and now Clara's story. Each piece clicked against the next, forming a picture he didn't want, but could no longer ignore. The orchard creaked in the wind, branches swaying like old witnesses, and Jack understood with cold certainty. The past wasn't done with him. It had only just begun to speak. The night after Clara left was restless. Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams while the wind moved like a restless tide through the orchard. Every word she had spoken circled in his mind. This land isn't just ruined trees. Sundance will show you. Sleep never fully came. When he finally rose before dawn, his body felt heavy, but his thoughts were sharper, carved into focus by unease. Outside, the sky was a muted gray, the first pale hints of morning bleeding across the ridge. Frost coated the ground, brittle beneath his boots. Sundance stood near the fence, his breath curling in steady clouds, ears pricked toward the orchard's far end. Jack watched him for a moment, then whispered, "All right, old boy. Show me." The horse turned, moving with deliberate steps down a narrow path between the trees. Jack followed, his jacket pulled tight against the cold. The orchard seemed to swallow him whole, branches arching overhead like dark ribs. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, as if the world itself held its breath. Sundance stopped suddenly beside a tree, older and wider than the rest. Its bark was scarred, gnarled from decades of storms, but its trunk was whole, untouched by the rot that had devoured its neighbors. The ground beneath was soft, disturbed, as though something had been buried there not long ago. Jack crouched, brushing away damp leaves. His fingers met resistance. He dug deeper until his nails scraped against metal. Heart pounding, he cleared away the soil, revealing a latch. It was a small chest, rusted green with age. Sundance snorted, pawing once at the earth as if to mark the spot. Jack hauled the chest free, its weight surprising. The lock was corroded, fragile. With a sharp blow from a rock, it gave way. Inside lay another bundle of documents, wrapped in waxed cloth. He pulled them out carefully, unfolding each page. There were letters, correspondence between Henry and names Jack didn't recognize, government officials, scientists, some dated as far back as 1978. One letter spoke of field results exceeding expectations. Another referenced restricted compounds awaiting further refinement. Jack's stomach knotted as he read, the truth tightening around him. These weren't just orchard experiments. They were the roots of something larger, something stolen and hidden. Beneath the papers were photographs, rows of trees heavy with fruit, scientists in white coats standing stiff among them. In one photo, Jack spotted Sundance, young and bright-eyed, tethered to the fence line while the men worked. The sight of the horse preserved in time sent a shiver down his spine. Sundance had witnessed it all, a living link between past and present. Jack sat back on his heels, the chest open before him. The valley was hushed, the only sound the soft flick of Sundance's tail. He realized then that Henry hadn't been exaggerating. The horse hadn't just been a companion. He had been a sentinel, a keeper of the orchard's memory, guiding Henry, and now Jack, toward the truth buried in its soil. He gathered the documents, pressing them tight against his chest. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You've carried this longer than anyone should." Sundance stepped closer, lowering his head until Jack felt the warmth of his breath against his shoulder. For a fleeting moment, Jack allowed himself to lean into that presence, to believe he wasn't alone in this burden. The walk back to the house felt heavier, each step weighted by the knowledge in his arms. The orchard loomed around him, not just as a graveyard of broken trees, but as a witness to decades of secrets. By the time he reached the porch, the sky had shifted to pale gold, sunlight catching the frost and making it glitter like shards of glass. Inside, Jack spread the documents across the table, his hands trembling. The scope of it all overwhelmed him. Scientific jargon he could barely decipher, signatures that hinted at authority, photographs that were undeniable. The truth was here, in ink and paper, but also in the eyes of the horse, standing just outside. He sank into the chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time since arriving, Jack felt the weight not only of Henry's legacy, but of Sundance's silent insistence. The horse had led him here, step by step, never faltering. When he finally looked up, sunlight streamed across the table, illuminating Henry's handwriting on one of the letters. Jack whispered the words aloud, barely audible. "Not the end, but the beginning." Outside, Sundance pawed the ground again, steady and deliberate, as if reminding Jack that this was only one piece of a larger path. The valley settled into darkness earlier than Jack expected. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened, a storm dragging its weight across the mountains. The air turned electric, heavy with the smell of rain. Jack spent the hours before nightfall pacing the kitchen, the newly unearthed documents spread across the table like fragile bones. He read them again and again, though the words blurred until they no longer made sense. Every page was proof, but proof of what exactly? Corruption? Theft? Betrayal? He still didn't know how to carry. As the first drops struck the windows, Jack heard it. The low hum of engines. His chest tightened. He moved to the window, heart thudding, and saw headlights carving their way up the dirt road. Not one vehicle this time. Two. Black SUVs, their beams cutting through rain like knives. Sundance screamed, a sound raw and violent, slicing through the storm. Jack bolted for the porch. The horse was at the far end of the fence, rearing against the night, hooves striking sparks on stone. Lightning flashed, and for an instant the whole orchard glowed stark white, trees skeletal, rain slashing, Sundance wild against the fence. Jack's instincts screamed, "Run!" He dashed back inside, grabbing the waterproof bag he had packed with the letters and photographs, the wooden box and older documents he left hidden in the attic. There wasn't time to gather everything. The sound of doors slamming outside carried through the storm. Men's voices rose, sharp and commanding. "Turner," one of them called, his words carrying above the wind. "We need to speak with you." Jack shoved the bag across his shoulder and ran for the back door. Sundance was already there, muscles trembling, eyes wide and burning. The horse shoved his head toward Jack, urging him. Jack fumbled with the latch, then pushed through the gate into the storm. Rain stung his face, cold and relentless. The voices grew closer. Flashlights sliced through the orchard, beams sweeping like predators' eyes. Jack grabbed a handful of Sundance's mane. The horse moved instantly, pulling him toward the narrow trail that climbed the ridge. They crashed through underbrush, branches slapping, mud sucking at Jack's boots. Behind them came shouts, then the unmistakable crack of footsteps in pursuit. Lightning struck again, revealing the path ahead in stark detail. Rocks jutting, trees twisted, the trail steep and slick. Sundance lunged upward, hooves finding impossible purchase. Jack clung to him, breath torn from his lungs, every step a battle between falling and rising. The storm grew louder, thunder rolling so close it shook the ground. Jack risked a glance back. Flashlights bobbed below. Men shouting, their forms distorted in the rain. They were gaining. He forced his body forward, whispering through clenched teeth, "Come on, old boy. Don't fail me now." Sundance surged higher, his body soaked and heaving, but his stride sure, his will unshaken. The trail twisted sharply, then leveled into a plateau sheltered by stone outcrops. Here the wind was less, the rain muted. Jack collapsed against a boulder, chest burning, the bag clutched tight against him. Sundance stood above him, head high, ears flicking, breath steaming like a furnace. The shouts below grew faint, swallowed by the storm. The men hadn't found the trail, at least not yet. Jack pressed his forehead against the cold stone, gasping, every muscle trembling. He had escaped, but he knew it was only temporary. They would return, and next time they would come harder. He looked up at Sundance, the horse's silhouette stark against the storm-lit sky. The animal had led him here without hesitation, as if the trail were already known to him. Jack realized with a shiver that it probably was. Henry must have taken this path countless times. Sundance had been waiting, holding the memory of escape for decades. Jack rose slowly, his hand brushing the horse's neck. "You saved me," he whispered, voice raw. "You knew where to go." The storm raged on, but within the plateau, there was a strange stillness, a pocket of safety carved from chaos. Jack found a shallow shelter beneath the rocks, enough to keep the rain off for the night. He spread the documents inside, the paper edges curling from damp air, and stared at them under the flicker of lightning. Every page now felt heavier, more dangerous. When the storm finally began to fade toward dawn, Jack sat awake with Sundance standing guard just beyond the rocks. The horse's ears flicked at every sound, his body steady, unyielding. Jack thought of Henry in this same place, decades earlier, fleeing the same shadows. And now the cycle had turned to him. As light broke across the ridge, Jack whispered into the quiet, "This isn't just inheritance. It's war." Sundance turned his head at the words, eyes reflecting the first pale sun. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the valley. Jack woke stiff and cold beneath the stone outcrop, the documents pressed against his chest, as though holding them tighter could keep the truth from slipping away. His clothes were damp, his boots caked with mud. For a long moment, he lay still, listening. No engines, no voices. Only the slow drip of water from the rocks above, and the soft crunch of hooves shifting nearby. Sundance stood a few feet away, his coat darkened from the rain, steam rising faintly in the early sun. His head lowered toward Jack, nostrils flaring, eyes calm now. Jack pushed himself up, every muscle aching, and reached for the horse. His hand found the rough dampness of Sundance's mane. For the first time since arriving in Idaho, Jack felt something solid under his feet. Not the land, not the house, but this animal, steady and unyielding. "You didn't leave me," Jack said softly. The words caught in his throat, as though they belonged to another man. Sundance flicked an ear, then nudged his shoulder with a weight both gentle and insistent. It was as if the horse had been waiting for those words, waiting for Jack to acknowledge that he wasn't alone. They made their way down the ridge slowly, the trail slick from the night's storm. Jack leaned against Sundance more than once, his boots sliding on wet stone, each time the horse steadied, moving with sure steps, guiding rather than being led. By the time they reached the orchard, Jack no longer felt like the master of the animal. He felt like the one being carried. The house loomed gray against the horizon, sagging but still standing. Jack stepped onto the porch, Sundance following close, and for once he didn't shoo the horse back to the paddock. He let him stand there, close enough that Jack could hear the steady rhythm of his breath through the walls. The sound filled the silence, a reminder that life still pulsed in this forgotten valley. Jack laid the bag of documents on the kitchen table, his hands lingering over the straps. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he sank into the chair and let his head fall into his hands. He had run, hidden, survived the night, but the weight inside the bag was heavier than ever. Proof, evidence, secrets carved into paper. He couldn't carry it alone. As if sensing his thoughts, Sundance nickered from the porch, low and steady. Jack raised his head. Through the cracked window, the horse's dark eye caught his own. There was no urgency in it now, only patience, the same patience Henry must have seen for 40 years. Jack stood, opened the door, and stepped outside. He pressed his forehead to Sundance's, the horse standing still as stone beneath the contact. The smell of damp coat, of earth and rain, filled Jack's lungs. "I can't do this alone," he whispered. "And maybe I don't have to." The admission loosened something in him. For months he had carried failure like a second skin. The failed ranch, the debts, the quiet shame of not being able to protect his wife from fate. But here, with this animal who had guarded Henry's secrets and now his own, Jack felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't dared name. Not hope, not yet, but trust. The rest of the day passed in silence. Jack mended a broken fence post, cleared fallen branches from the orchard's path, small work to calm restless hands. Sundance shadowed him, never straying far. When Jack paused, the horse paused. When Jack moved, Sundance followed, their steps weaving into a rhythm that felt older than either of them. By dusk, Jack sat on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders, the bag of documents at his feet. Sundance grazed quietly nearby, his coat glinting in the fading light. The valley had grown quiet again, but Jack no longer heard emptiness in it. He heard breath, movement, the faint song of something alive beneath the ruin. "You waited all these years," Jack said into the twilight. "For him. And now, for me," his voice broke, but the words hung true. Sundance lifted his head, ears pricked toward him, then returned to grazing. Jack leaned back against the porch post, eyes closing. For the first time since he'd driven up the dirt road days ago, he didn't feel like a man waiting for the world to end. He felt like a man being led toward something, though he still couldn't see where. When he finally drifted to sleep, Sundance stood watch in the meadow, his silhouette a sentinel against the stars. The call was harder to make than Jack expected. He sat at the kitchen table with the old rotary phone Henry had left behind, the receiver heavy in his hand. The documents lay spread out around him like a jury, their silent testimony pressing him forward. He hadn't spoken to Megan in years, not since the bitter argument after his father's funeral. Words had been thrown that neither of them had taken back. She had gone west to build her life in Seattle, chasing stories for newspapers and television, while Jack stayed behind in Montana, chasing cattle and debt. But tonight, silence wasn't enough. He couldn't carry this weight alone. His thumb spun the dial slowly, each click loud in the empty house. When the line finally clicked alive, he almost hung up. Then her voice came, brisk and sharp, the cadence of someone who lived in deadlines. "Hello." "Megan," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It's Jack." There was a pause. He could almost hear her sorting through years of distance. "Jack. That's a surprise. I wouldn't call unless it mattered," he said. He glanced at the papers, Henry's shaky handwriting staring back at him. "I've found something. Something big. And I think I'm in trouble." Her silence was longer this time, though the hum of the city crackled faintly in the background. "Trouble's vague, Jack. You'll have to do better." So he told her, halting at first, then faster, spilling out the orchard, Henry's journal, the photographs, the buried box, the men at the gate, the chase in the storm. He left nothing out except the trembling in his own hands. When he finished, the line was so quiet he thought she might have hung up. Finally, she said, "Do you still have the documents?" "Yes." "Good. Don't move them. Don't burn them. Don't hide them anywhere new. Just keep them safe." "I'm coming. You don't understand." "I do," she interrupted. "This is exactly the kind of thing I deal with. And if half of what you're saying is true, you're in over your head. You need help." Her voice softened just slightly. "And maybe we need this." The line went dead before he could answer. Jack stared at the receiver, the dial tone buzzing like a warning. The next afternoon, her car pulled into the drive, a compact sedan dusted with highway miles. She stepped out in a trench coat, her hair pulled back, eyes sharp behind thin glasses. She looked nothing like the cousin he remembered from summers on horseback. She looked like someone who had fought her way into boardrooms and newsrooms and refused to be silenced. "Jack," she said simply, shutting the door. "Megan." They stood awkwardly for a moment, the weight of years between them. Then Sundance nickered from the paddock. Megan turned, her eyes widening slightly. "Is that—" "Sundance," Jack said. "Henry's horse. Still here." She walked to the fence, her hand resting lightly on the rail. The horse approached, sniffing her coat, then nudged her shoulder. Megan laughed, a sound Jack hadn't heard in years. "I remember him," she said softly. "He was younger then." So were we. The tension eased. For a few minutes they stood side by side, watching Sundance graze. Then Megan straightened, her expression shifting back to business. "Show me what you found." Inside, Jack laid the documents across the table. Megan leaned in, scanning each page with the focus of someone trained to catch details others missed. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she turned over photographs, traced signatures, and read Henry's notes. "This is real," she whispered finally. "This isn't just the ramblings of an old man." "If these tests tie back to pharmaceutical patents..." She shook her head. "Jack, this could blow open a case that's been whispered about for decades." Jack exhaled slowly, relief and dread mingling. "So I'm not crazy." "No," Megan said. She met his eyes. "But you are in danger. These men you saw, they'll want to erase every trace of this, including you." The room fell silent. Outside, Sundance pawed the ground, steady and deliberate. Megan glanced toward the sound, her gaze softening. "Henry trusted that horse," she murmured. "Maybe more than he trusted people." And now I see why Jack rubbed a hand across his face. "So what now?" Megan tapped the pile of papers. "Now we bring light to it. Carefully. Smartly. I'll make calls to people I trust, journalists, lawyers, but we'll need proof beyond what's here. We'll need more." Jack looked toward the orchard, its twisted silhouettes etched against the fading sky. He thought of the plateau, the storm, the secrets still buried beneath the soil. He felt Sundance's gaze on him, patient, waiting. "Then we follow where the horse leads," Jack said. Megan studied him, a flicker of the old cousin she'd once admired surfacing in her smile. "For once, Jack, that doesn't sound crazy." The kitchen table was no longer just a table. With Megan's arrival, it became a war room. Pages were organized into stacks, photographs clipped together, Henry's journal spread open like scripture. Jack hovered at the edges while Megan moved with quick, precise motions, her pen scribbling notes, her phone pressed constantly to her ear. Jack listened as she spoke to people he couldn't see. Voices on the other end belonging to lawyers, reporters, old colleagues she trusted. The words flew fast: intellectual property, suppressed evidence, whistleblower protection. Jack understood little of the language, but he understood the weight. Every call she made pulled Henry's secrets further into the open. By the second day, the orchard no longer felt silent. Jack could sense eyes on him even when none were there. Twice he caught glimpses of vehicles parked far down the ridge road, engines idling, disappearing when he tried to draw closer. Sundance reacted first each time, ears flat, body rigid, a warning before Jack even turned his head. At night, Megan spread papers across the floor, piecing together timelines from Henry's notes and the letters. "They erased him," she said, her voice tight. "Every breakthrough tied to this orchard was claimed by corporations. The drugs that saved lives, the patents worth billions. They buried the origin and left Henry with nothing. And now, Jack, you hold proof they never wanted seen." Jack leaned against the wall, arms folded. "And because of that, they'll come for me." "Yes," Megan said bluntly, "but you're not alone. Not anymore." The first article appeared online 2 days later. A smaller outlet Megan trusted ran a story hinting at buried agricultural experiments in Idaho, tied to pharmaceutical giants. They didn't mention Henry by name, or Jack, but the orchard was there, between the lines. Jack sat on the porch with Sundance grazing nearby as he read the words on Megan's laptop. The headline glowed in the fading light. Forgotten orchards. Forgotten truths. He felt the world tilt, or what had once been his uncle's private burden was now public air. That night, the consequences arrived. Jack woke to the sound of footsteps crunching outside. He reached for the lamp, but Sundance's scream cut through the darkness before he could move. The horse was at the fence, hooves pounding, his body a wall of defiance. Shadows darted just beyond the porch light, figures moving, too many to count. Jack grabbed the rifle Henry had left in the corner, heart hammering. Megan stood in the doorway, phone in her hand, already dialing. The figures lingered at the edge of the orchard, silent, waiting. Then, as quickly as they'd come, they melted into the dark. "They're watching us," Megan said, her face pale. The article rattled someone. For the first time, Jack didn't feel the urge to run. He looked at Sundance, still pacing the fence, head high, breath heavy. The horse was unbroken, unyielding. Jack realized he had to be the same. The following morning, Megan sat him down. "We need more than papers and old photographs. They'll call it circumstantial. We need physical evidence, something undeniable." Jack thought of the plateau, of the storm, of the sense that Sundance still had more to show him. He nodded slowly. "Then we go back into the orchard. We find what Henry left." Megan studied him, her expression hard but proud. "Then we fight. Not just quietly, not just in the shadows. We fight them where they can't erase us." The words hung between them, heavy but true. Outside, the orchard creaked in the wind, its branches whispering as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment. Sundance stood at the fence, his gaze locked on the horizon. The public fight had begun. The first sign of the storm was not thunder, but silence. The valley went still in a way Jack had come to recognize as warning. Birds vanished from the branches, the wind fell mute, and the orchard stood rigid against the sky. Jack felt it in his bones before the clouds even broke. By late afternoon, the horizon was a bruise, purple-black and swollen with rain. Megan sat at the table inside, papers spread around her, but even she paused to glance at the window when the first gust rattled the glass. "It's coming hard," she murmured. Jack stepped out onto the porch. Sundance was already restless, pacing the fence, ears flat. The air crackled, metallic, the smell of ozone and rot mingling into something sharp. Jack's chest tightened. Not just with dread, but with memory. The last storm had brought pursuit, shadowed figures, a desperate climb to safety. He braced himself for more than weather. The first strike of lightning lit the orchard in a ghostly glow. Branches twisted like arms in agony, fruit splitting open as the wind tore through. Rain followed in a sudden sheet, pounding the earth, drumming on the sagging roof of the house. Jack ran into the paddock, mud sucking at his boots to calm Sundance. The horse tossed his head, wild-eyed, muscles quivering, but when Jack pressed a hand to his neck, Sundance stilled just enough to let him stay close. Then Jack saw it. In the heart of the orchard, where the oldest trees stood, a massive trunk shuddered under the wind. With a crack that sounded like bone breaking, it toppled, roots tearing free of the earth. Jack flinched, heart hammering. The ground shook, water rushing into the cavity left behind. Megan appeared at the door, shouting over the roar. "Jack!" Inside. But Jack didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the pit where the tree had stood. In the flash of lightning, he saw something buried deep in the soil, metal glinting beneath mud and roots. He staggered forward, Sundance pressing against his shoulder as if to guide him. Rain drenched him, blinded him, but he dropped to his knees at the pit's edge, clawing through the muck. His fingers struck steel. A container, larger than the boxes he had found before, sealed tight. He heaved, muscles screaming, until the thing broke free with a sucking groan. Lightning illuminated it, a reinforced case, heavier than anything Henry had hidden before. Sundance reared, his hooves striking mud, as though urging Jack to move. Jack dragged the case toward the house, slipping, cursing, half carried by adrenaline. Megan met him at the porch, eyes wide as she took in the object. Together they hauled it inside, water streaming from their clothes. The storm raged around them, the house shuddering. Jack forced the lock open with Henry's old crowbar. Inside, layers of sealed jars and vials gleamed under the lamplight, samples of fruit, soil, leaves, each labeled in Henry's careful script. Alongside them, folders thick with typed reports, government letterheads, signatures. Megan's hands shook as she lifted one folder. This is it. This is undeniable. She looked up at Jack, rain dripping from her hair. Henry kept the original specimens. He kept everything thunder cracked so loud it rattled the windows. Jack stared at the contents, the magnitude sinking in. This wasn't just a secret anymore. This was evidence powerful enough to topple giants. Outside, another tree went down, splintering under the wind. But as Jack glanced through the rain-streaked window, he saw something strange. Shoots of green already pushing through the mud. Fragile, but alive. The storm had torn the orchard open, but it had also revealed resilience, life waiting beneath decay. Jack turned to Sundance, who stood in the paddock, drenched, his body gleaming like carved obsidian under the lightning. The horse met his gaze, steady despite the chaos. Jack whispered, half to himself, half to Henry, half to the animal who had carried it all. The orchard isn't dead. Not yet. Megan closed the folder with trembling hands. Then neither is the truth. They sat there through the night, the storm battering the valley, the case open between them. Each crack of thunder shook the house, but neither moved. They knew now there was no turning back. The orchard had revealed its last secret, and the fight ahead would demand everything they had left to give. The storm broke by morning, leaving the valley washed clean. The orchard glistened under the pale sun, branches dripping, earth dark and heavy. Whole trees had fallen, splintered across the rows, but beneath the wreckage, Jack saw small shoots pushing through the soil, fresh and green. It was as though the violence of the night had torn away the dead, so the living could rise. Megan brewed coffee on the stove, her eyes hollow but fierce. The reinforced case sat open on the table between them, its contents undeniable. The vials of preserved fruit, the sealed jars of soil, the signed reports. All of it was there, intact, impossible to dismiss. Jack ran his hand across the edge of the case, the cold metal grounding him. You realize, Megan said quietly, this will change everything. Jack nodded. He thought of Henry hunched over this evidence for decades, the solitude that had consumed him. He thought of Clara's warnings, of the men in dark coats who had circled like wolves, and he thought of Sundance, steady, relentless Sundance, who had led him to each secret in turn. The fight that followed was not swift. Weeks blurred into months as Megan's network widened, as lawyers filed motions and journalists pieced together the story. Jack sat through interviews with federal investigators, his voice steady, but his hands tight on the table. He testified not only to what Henry had left, but to what he had seen. The men at the gate, the chase in the storm, the surveillance that never stopped. The pharmaceutical giants fought back, their lawyers polished and merciless. But the evidence Henry had preserved was overwhelming. Patents were traced, timelines reconstructed, correspondences cross-referenced. One by one, the lies unraveled. Headlines spread. Decades of corporate theft exposed. Forgotten Orchard becomes center of federal inquiry. The horse that guarded the truth. Through it all, Sundance remained at the orchard, grazing among the surviving trees. Visitors began to arrive, first reporters, then strangers who had read the story and wanted to see for themselves the place where truth had waited. Silent for so long. Jack gave them tours reluctantly at first, his voice rough, his words spare. But as he spoke of Henry, of the storm, of Sundance guiding him, his voice grew steadier, the bitterness in it softening into something like pride. By the following spring, the orchard had begun to recover. With proper care, the soil responded, new growth spreading like quiet fire. Blossoms bloomed where rot had once ruled, white petals drifting through the air like fragments of memory. Jack stood among them one morning, the scent of apple flowers heavy, sunlight spilling gold across the valley. For the first time, he felt the land breathing again. Sundance moved beside him, slower now, his body showing the years. Jack laid a hand against his neck, feeling the warmth, the steady pulse beneath the spotted coat. "We did it," he whispered. "You carried him all those years. And you carried me, too." The horse turned his head, dark eyes steady as always. In them, Jack saw more than instinct. He saw the weight of Henry's trust, the patience of decades, the quiet guardianship that had brought him to this day. That evening, Megan joined him on the porch. The orchard stretched green before them, alive in a way Jack hadn't believed possible when he first arrived. "It's not just land anymore," she said. "It's a promise." Jack nodded. He looked at Sundance grazing peacefully in the dusk, his silhouette etched against the fading light. And promises have to be kept. Visitors continued to come, their footsteps soft among the rows, their voices hushed as though walking through a cathedral. Jack told them the story, not for sympathy, not for spectacle, but because the truth deserved to be spoken aloud. And each time he ended the story the same way, standing beside Sundance. Sometimes the world hides its treasures in the most unlikely places. Sometimes it takes the wisdom of an old horse to remind us that what looks like the end is only the beginning. The crowd would always fall silent then, the orchard breathing around them, the horse lowering his head as if acknowledging the truth of the words. When summer came, Jack walked the orchard alone at dawn. The air was warm, the trees heavy with young fruit, the ground alive with green. He paused beneath the largest of the surviving trees, its blossoms now small apples, firm and growing. He thought of Henry, of the decades of silence, of the lonely fight that had ended here. "Rest easy," he whispered into the branches. "We carried it through." Sundance stepped up beside him, nudging his shoulder, the gesture as familiar now as breath. Jack smiled, his hand resting against the horse's mane. The valley was no longer empty. The orchard was no longer ruined, and he was no longer alone. The season had turned, and with it, so had Jack. And now I want to hear from you. Do you believe a horse can carry not just a man, but a truth that changes lives? If you do, comment 1 below. If you think it's only a story of chance, comment 0. Your voice matters. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may be the one that touches your heart even deeper, and you won't want to miss it.